The image of Alexander the Great that has calcified in the modern imagination is one of a golden-haired youth, sword aloft, charging into the foam of the Hellespont with the reckless abandon of a romantic hero. This narrative, carefully curated by the court historians of the 4th century and amplified by centuries of Western myth-making, suggests an empire forged in the heat of impulsive genius and a thirst for individual glory. Yet the forensic reality of the Macedonian conquest reveals a far more sober truth hidden beneath the dust of the phalanx. To move 40,000 men across a continent is not an act of poetic inspiration, but a grueling exercise in mathematical precision. Alexander's true genius was not found in the sudden cavalry charge at Gaugamela, but in the silent candle-lit tents where Greek secretaries and Persian scribes reconciled the tax rolls of a dozen different nations. He understood, perhaps more than any commander before him, that the momentum of an army is measured in bushels of grain and the reliability of its pack animals. Driven by this realization, Alexander did not seek to uproot the ancient Achaemenid Empire. He sought to inhabit it, recognizing that the survival of his vision depended entirely on the preservation of the very systems he had ostensibly come to destroy. In the 4th century BC, the Hellenic world was gripped by a psychological paradox, a profound sense of cultural superiority, coupled with a deep, unspoken awe of Persian scale. The Greeks viewed the East as a sprawling, decadent monolith, yet they were acutely aware that their own city-states were mere fractious outposts compared to the administrative majesty of Susa and Babylon. When Alexander crossed into Asia, he was moving into a landscape that had been meticulously organized for centuries. The Persian great kings had mastered the art of distance through the royal road, a sophisticated network of postal stations and supply depots that allowed messages to travel 1,500 miles in a week. Consequently, Alexander's advance was less a journey into the unknown and more a hostile takeover of an existing corporate structure. He did not burn the Persian archives, he staffed them. He did not execute the satraps, he audited them. This continuity was the essential lubricant of his conquest. Had he chosen to dismantle the Persian bureaucracy, the logistical friction of governing such a vast territory would have ground his campaign to a halt before he ever reached the Hindu Kush. The logistical requirements of the Macedonian army were staggering, demanding a caloric intake that dictated the very root of the conquest. A single soldier required roughly 3 pounds of grain and 2 quarts of water a day, meaning the army consumed nearly 120,000 pounds of food every 24 hours. Inevitably, this created a causality chain that governed the pace of history. The army could only move where the harvest had already been gathered or where a deep-water port could be secured. Forensic evidence found in the daily journals or ephemerides kept by his royal secretary, Eumenes of Cardia, reveals a king obsessed with the minutiae of the calendar. Alexander's movements were not dictated by the whim of a wanderer, but the ripening cycles of the Mesopotamian wheat fields and the seasonal flooding of the Nile. The preservation of the Persian tax system was therefore a strategic necessity. By maintaining the tribute demands of the previous regime, Alexander ensured that the local governors had a vested interest in the stability of the harvest. The silver that once flowed to the great King Darius now flowed into Alexander's war chest, funding the wages of the mercenaries who held the lines of communication open. Deep within the baggage train of the army, far from the glory of the front line, lived the true architects of the empire. One such individual might have been a low-level Greek clerk, perhaps a man from Cardia or Miletus, whose fingers were permanently stained with the ink of the chancellery. He would spend his days in a humid tent, translating Aramaic tax receipts into Koine Greek, his eyes straining under the flicker of an oil lamp to ensure that the grain quotas from a distant village in Lydia matched the requirements of a garrison in the Levant. This man, whose name is lost to time, was the human gear in a machine that bridged two worlds. To him, the conquest was not a matter of gods and heroes, but a relentless struggle against the entropy of a 1,000-mile supply line. His work ensured that when the phalanx reached the next river crossing, the bridges were already repaired and the granaries were full. It was this administrative discipline that separated Alexander from the temporary raiders of the past. He was building a state that could breathe on its own, independent of his physical presence. The fragility of this entire enterprise is best observed in the moments when the ledger failed. History is often a prisoner of small decisions, and in the winter of 330 BC, the fate of the empire hung on the survival of the Persian postal system. Had the local couriers, the famous Angarion, decided to abandon their posts during the transition of power, Alexander would have been blinded, unable to coordinate the disparate wings of his army across the Iranian plateau. A single missed shipment of fodder or delayed report of a local rebellion could have triggered a cascading failure of the entire front. In the Gedrosian Desert, years later, we see the terrifying alternative. When the coordination between the fleet and the land forces broke down, the result was a humanitarian catastrophe that nearly ended the Macedonian royal line. This failure serves as a forensic anchor, proving that Alexander's invincibility was merely the byproduct of a functioning supply chain. When the logistics collapsed, the myth of the God King collapsed with it, leaving a trail of bleached bones across the sand. The myth of the wandering warlord persists because it is easier to romanticize a conqueror than to study a tax collector. Yet the reality of the Macedonian era was defined by a transition from the charismatic leadership of the Homeric age to the institutionalized governance of the Hellenistic period. Alexander realized that a sword can win a kingdom, but only a ledger can keep it. By adopting the title of the great king and dressing in the robes of the Persian court, he was signaling his submission to the existing mechanics of power. He was not an outsider breaking a system, but a successor claiming his inheritance. This decision to prioritize administrative continuity over cultural destruction allowed the gears of the East to keep turning, ensuring that the wealth of Asia continued to circulate long after his death. The survival of his vision rested on the fact that he was disciplined enough to listen to his secretaries as closely as he listened to his generals. Ultimately, the blueprint of the modern state, with its centralized bureaucracy, standardized coinage, and globalized supply chains, finds its earliest ancestor in this forced marriage of Greek intellect and Persian infrastructure. The boundaries of the satrapies Alexander preserved would, in many cases, become the borders of modern provinces and nations, a testament to the enduring logic of the Achaemenid map. The roads he secured and the cities he founded were not merely monuments to his ego, but strategic hubs designed to facilitate the movement of goods and information. Even today, the logistical principles he refined are echoed in the way modern empires project power across vast distances. The ink on the parchments of Eumenes has long since faded, but the administrative architecture of the world Alexander inherited and refined remains the skeletal structure upon which the history of the West was built. The genius was never in the wandering, it was in the management of the return.
The dust of the Iranian plateau did not simply coat the armor of the Macedonian phalanx. It began to seep into the very psyche of the high command, signaling a transformation that would prove more volatile than any set-piece battle. By the time Alexander reached the ancient heartlands of Media and Persis, the war of conquest had evolved into a far more complex struggle for administrative survival. The Macedonian mind, rooted in the egalitarian traditions of a warrior king who was merely first among equals, was a rigid structure of tribal loyalty ill-equipped for the fluid complexities of an imperial court. Driven by the cold realization that he could not govern millions of subjects through a small clique of European officers alone, Alexander began the deliberate process of reinventing the monarchy. This was not the erratic behavior of a man lost to Oriental decadence, as his detractors suggested, but a calculated political necessity designed to bridge the chasm between a conquering minority and a vast, sophisticated majority. In this era, the spirit of the times was defined by a profound sense of vertigo. The Macedonians had marched off the edge of their known world and were now asked to dissolve their identity into the very culture they had spent years trying to dismantle. The most visible manifestation of this shift was the introduction of proskynesis, the Persian ritual of prostration before the sovereign. To a Persian, this was a gesture of social hierarchy and civic respect. To a Macedonian, it was an act of blasphemy reserved only for the gods. Consequently, the attempt to implement this court etiquette created an immediate and visceral rift. Evidence of this tension survives in the accounts of the court historian Callisthenes, who famously refused the gesture, arguing that such honors would diminish the king's humanity rather than elevate his status. This refusal was not merely a philosophical disagreement, but a signal of a deepening insurgency among the intellectual and military elite. Inevitably, the tension moved from the banquet halls to the barracks. A veteran of the Silver Shields, a man whose body was a map of scars from the Granicus to the Jaxartes, would have stood in the shadow of the royal pavilion, his hands calloused from years of gripping the sarissa, watching his king don the purple and white diadem of the Achaemenids. To such a man, the king was no longer the leader who shared their rations and slept in the mud, but a remote Eastern autocrat who had traded Macedonian iron for Persian silk. This psychological alienation provided the fuel for the Philotis affair, a moment of high-stakes political violence that stripped away any remaining illusions of unity. Philotis, the commander of the companion cavalry and son of the venerable Parmenion, was accused of failing to report a conspiracy against the king's life. The atmosphere in the camp was one of suffocating paranoia. Alexander moved with predatory speed. The trials were swift, the executions brutal. Philotis was tortured and stoned, but the logic of the purge demanded a more significant victim. Parmenion, the man who had served Philip II and anchored Alexander's left wing in every major victory, was assassinated in Ecbatana by royal decree before he could even learn of his son's death. This was a turning point of absolute consequence. By eliminating the old guard, Alexander removed the primary obstacle to his reforms, but he also severed the emotional bond that had held the Macedonian core together. The army was no longer a brotherhood, it was a state instrument, and the king was its undisputed master. Seeking to codify this new reality, Alexander orchestrated the mass marriages at Susa, a grand experiment in social engineering that aimed to fuse the two cultures at a biological level. 80 of his highest-ranking companions were wed to Persian noblewomen, while over 10,000 ordinary soldiers were incentivized to legitimize their unions with local women. The Susa weddings were documented with the clinical precision of a royal ledger, noting the dowries paid and the purple robes gifted to the grooms. This was an attempt to create a new hybrid ruling class, a generation of successors who would owe their primary loyalty to the empire rather than to a specific homeland. However, the Macedonian elite viewed these marriages as a dilution of their bloodline and a surrender of their hard-won spoils. The friction was not just cultural, it was economic. The integration of 30,000 Persian youths trained in the Macedonian fashion and dubbed the Epigony created a direct threat to the veterans' monopoly on military power. They saw themselves being replaced by the very people they had defeated. The administrative machinery of the empire further strained under the weight of this integration. Alexander's reliance on local satraps, such as the Persian Mazaeus in Babylon, was a masterstroke of continuity that prevented widespread insurrection. Yet this created a dual-track power structure, where Greek military commanders often found themselves at odds with indigenous civil governors. The friction of integration was constant. In the provinces, the balance of power was a fragile thing, held together only by the terrifying speed of Alexander's personal intervention. Had Alexander chosen to remain a traditional Macedonian king, treating Persia merely as a plundered province rather than a partner in empire, the Greek presence in Asia might have remained a fleeting military occupation. Instead, his insistence on a global state forced a cultural synthesis that would outlast his own life. The tragedy of the period lies in the fact that the closer Alexander came to achieving a unified world state, the more he alienated the men who had built it for him. The fragility of this grand design was never more apparent than in the final years of the campaign, where the king's persona seemed to oscillate between a Greek hero and an Eastern god. One small decision, perhaps a more lenient approach to the court rituals or a slower pace of integration, might have preserved the loyalty of his generals and prevented the fractured civil wars that followed his death. But Alexander was a man driven by a singular vision of homonia or concord, believing that the only way to rule the world was to encompass it entirely. This ambition carried a heavy price. The resentment that simmered in the tents at Opus and the palaces of Babylon was the direct result of a policy that prioritized the stability of the empire over the comfort of its conquerors. The legacy of this friction is still visible in the way modern states navigate the tensions of multiculturalism and the integration of disparate populations within a single border. The ruins of the cities he founded, once vibrant centers of a blended world, serve as a forensic reminder of the cost of such an endeavor. The border between East and West, blurred by Alexander's decree 3 millennia ago, remains one of the most contested political and psychological landscapes in the modern world, proving that the friction of integration is a force that history can describe but never truly resolve.
By the time the Macedonian vanguard reached the foothills of the Paropamisadae, the nature of the campaign had fundamentally shifted from a kinetic war of conquest to an exercise in existential logistics. The army was no longer merely a military instrument, it had become a sprawling, mobile capital, a city of 30,000 tents that breathed and moved with the rhythm of the king's ambition. Behind the phalanx marched a secondary army of scribes, surveyors, and tax collectors, men who carried the apparatus of a Greek state into a landscape that possessed no vocabulary for it. This migration was driven by the inescapable reality that a king cannot rule what he cannot measure. Consequently, the spears were followed by the reed pens of the bematists, the professional step measurers, whose task it was to record every mile of the march, transforming the chaotic geography of the East into the orderly columns of a ledger. This obsession with data was not merely academic. It was the only mechanism preventing the empire from dissolving into the very dust it traversed. Every sunrise saw the striking of thousands of canvas shelters, a process so practiced it occurred in near silence, leaving behind only the scorched circles of campfires and the discarded refuse of a civilization on the move. The infrastructure of the Persian royal road, once the pride of Darius, now served as the fraying lifeline of a Macedonian king.
While the road provided a paved spine for the empire, its efficiency began to collapse under the sheer weight of the distance Alexander had placed between himself and his base of power in Pella. A courier riding from the banks of the Indus to the Mediterranean faced a journey of several months, meaning that by the time a royal decree reached a governor in Lydia, the king who had issued it might already be dead or 1,000 miles further into the unknown. Inevitably, this created a vacuum of authority. To fill this void, Alexander was forced to elevate the hetairoi, his elite companion cavalry, into a new class of roving administrators. These men, trained for the charge and the melee, now found themselves governing satrapies the size of European kingdoms. They were required to be both warriors and accountants, collecting tribute in silver talents while maintaining the peace through the threat of the Sarissa. This transition was not seamless. It bred a deep-seated resentment among the old guard, who viewed the ledger as a weapon of the weak. Yet it was the only way to ensure that the king's will remained a tangible force in provinces that had never seen his face. The psychological state of the rank and file during this period was a profound displacement. In the 4th century BCE, the world was perceived as a finite space with a clear center, yet the soldiers now felt they were walking off the very edge of the map. This zeitgeist of unmooring was not merely a product of fatigue, but of a spiritual exhaustion. They were men who had conquered the known world, only to find that the world was far larger and indifferent than their myths had promised. Driven by this sense of isolation, the camp became a claustrophobic society where rumors carried more weight than reality. Consider the case of a single unnamed Macedonian groom tasked with the care of the baggage horses near the Khyber Pass. For 6 years, his world had been defined by the rear of a supply wagon and the smell of wet leather. He had not heard the Greek language spoken in a woman in half a decade, and his only connection to his home in the Peloponnese was a rusted bronze coin he kept stitched into his tunic, a currency that was now worthless in the markets of Taxila. For men like him, the king was no longer a leader, but a distant, terrifying force of nature that moved them across the earth like chess pieces. The breakdown of communication necessitated the implementation of a brutal and pervasive intelligence network. Alexander relied on the king's eyes and ears, a system of informants who bypassed the official chain of command to report directly to the royal tent. This atmosphere of paranoia was the inevitable byproduct of a command structure that outpaced its own biology. Swift punishment became the only substitute for consistent oversight. When the satrap of Carmania was suspected of negligence, he was not summoned for a trial. He was met by an executioner before the royal letter had even been fully unrolled. This culture of fear was the glue holding the empire together, yet it was incredibly fragile. Had the spring monsoons arrived just 2 weeks earlier in 326 BCE, the mud would have rendered the mountain passes impassable for the couriers, potentially triggering a coordinated revolt among the western governors who believed the king was trapped in the mud of the Punjab. History hung on the speed of a horse's gallop and the dryness of a leather satchel. The king was acutely aware that his empire was a ghost, a series of commands held together by the fading memory of his previous victories. This period of the campaign illustrates the moment the man vanished and the myth began. To the subjects in the distant west, Alexander was no longer a person, but a divine abstraction, a name on a coin, a shadow cast from the east. The sheer scale of the conquest had transformed the monarchy into a remote, almost celestial authority. The king's vision had outpaced the physical ability of his couriers to deliver his commands, leading to a state of permanent crisis management. Even as he planned for further expansions into the heart of India, the foundations of his earlier conquests were already beginning to settle into new permanent shapes. The administrative divisions he established, driven by the frantic need for order, would outlive his own life by centuries. The borders drawn in the dust of a tent by candlelight, under the pressure of a looming rebellion or a failed harvest, would eventually define the graveyards of empires and the frontiers of modern nations. The weight of the world was not just the land he had taken, but the impossible task of keeping it all from falling silent.
The dust of the Gedrosian Desert had not yet settled from the lungs of the Macedonian vanguard when the first reports of systemic collapse reached the royal pavilion. Alexander had returned to the heart of his empire, not as a conquering hero, but as a ghost haunting his own administration. For 60 days, as the army withered under the sun and the baggage train vanished into the shifting dunes, a collective psychological shift had occurred across the satrapies of Asia. Believing the king to be dead, or at the very least broken beyond the capacity to rule, the governors he had installed began to revert to the ancient, predatory habits of the regional autocrat. This was not a sudden insurrection of the populace, but a quiet, calcifying rot within the machinery of the state itself. Driven by the vacuum of authority, men like Astaspes in Carmania and Cleander in Media had begun to raise private armies and plunder the very treasuries they were sworn to protect. The empire, so recently forged through blood and mobility, was beginning to ossify into a collection of competing fiefdoms. Inevitably, the return of the king triggered a crisis of survival for those who had bet on his demise. The most glaring symptom of this administrative decay was the flight of Harpalus, the royal treasurer and a childhood friend of Alexander. Harpalus had spent the king's absence in Babylonian luxury, squandering the imperial wealth on imported Athenian courtesans and grand floral displays in the desert. Upon hearing that Alexander had emerged from the Gedrosian waste, Harpalus did not seek audience or forgiveness. Instead, he seized 5,000 talents of silver, hired 6,000 mercenaries, and fled toward the Mediterranean. This was the definitive signal that the era of personal loyalty, the bedrock of the Macedonian meritocracy, had fractured. Alexander's response was not the emotional outburst of a betrayed friend, but the clinical calculation of a monarch who realized that the survival of the institution now outweighed the lives of its architects. Consequently, the purge that followed was characterized by a forensic coldness, a systematic removal of any element that threatened the absolute centralization of power. The atmosphere in the royal court at Susa became one of suffocating tension, where the silence of the king was more terrifying than his speech. Evidence of the purge's scale is anchored in the records of the executions that moved like a scythe through the imperial hierarchy. In Carmania, Astaspes was summoned to the royal presence only to be met by the executioner's blade before he could offer a defense. In Media, the generals Cleander, Sitalces, and Heracon, men who had served Alexander since the crossing of the Hellespont, were brought before the army to face charges of sacrilege and extortion. They were not merely dismissed, they were liquidated. The speed of these trials reflected a new urgent pacing in Alexander's governance. No longer was there time for the slow deliberations of the Macedonian assembly. The king's word had become the law of the empire, and the empire demanded blood as collateral for its stability. In the midst of this political upheaval, the human cost was often borne by those far below the rank of satrap. Consider a low-ranking scribe in the treasury at Paropamisadae, a man who had spent his life recording the influx of tribute with meticulous care. When the purge reached his district, he found himself caught between the directives of a corrupt governor and the lethal scrutiny of the king's inspectors. Having followed orders to divert funds into a private account, he was found guilty of complicity. He was executed in the shadow of the tomb of Cyrus the Great, his body left to the elements as a secondary footnote to the fall of his masters.
This individual's death was statistically insignificant in the broader narrative of the empire, yet it served as the essential friction that ensured the gears of the new administration would turn without dissent. It was through thousands of such minor, brutal corrections that the total obedience of the crown was established. The fragility of this moment cannot be overstated. The entire imperial project teetered on the edge of a different outcome. Had the Gedrosian crossing been only slightly more disastrous, or had a single sandstorm lasted an extra day, Alexander might have returned with an army too weak to enforce his will. In such a scenario, the satraps would likely have declared independence, fragmenting the empire into a dozen Hellenistic warring states decades before the actual Diadochi Wars. The purge was a desperate gambit to prevent this premature collapse, a violent reassertion of the center over the periphery. It was during this period of restructuring that Alexander issued the Exiles Decree, a move that bypassed the authority of both the satraps and the Greek city-states. By commanding all cities to readmit their political exiles, the king effectively created tens of thousands of loyalists, beholden only to him, undermining the local power structures that had allowed the corruption to flourish in the first place. This decree, however, fundamentally altered the psychological relationship between the king and the Greek world. The cities of the League of Corinth saw this as a direct violation of their autonomy, a transition from a negotiated alliance to a dictated servitude. The spirit of the times was shifting from the shared glory of the Pan-Hellenic Crusade to the grim reality of a universal monarchy. The Macedonian officers, who had once viewed themselves as the king's peers, now found themselves replaced by a new tier of loyalists, many of them Persians who understood the protocols of absolute rule far better than the rough mountaineers of Pella. Alexander was no longer the first among equals. He was the master of the world, and the world was a place of ledgers, decrees, and executions. The meritocracy of the battlefield had been superseded by a hierarchy of absolute rule, where survival depended more on administrative compliance than on martial valor. The purge of the satraps was the final act in the transformation of Alexander's venture. It signaled that the empire was no longer a personal odyssey or a temporary occupation, but a permanent, self-sustaining institution. The machinery of the state was being rebuilt to function regardless of the character of the man sitting on the throne. By the time the king reached Babylon, the internal threats had been neutralized, and the governors who remained were those who understood that their lives were on loan from the crown. The rust had been scraped away, but the metal was cold and unyielding. The legacy of this clinical restructuring is visible even today in the very concept of the centralized state. The administrative structures Alexander refined during this purge, the direct communication from the center to the citizen, the professionalization of the civil service, and the use of the law as a tool of political homogenization, form the ancestral DNA of modern governance. The borders he secured through blood and decree have long since vanished, but the logic of the absolute state, prioritized over the individual, remains the silent architecture of the modern world.
In the stagnant heat of June 322 BCE, the air inside the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II was thick with the scent of unwashed armor and burning frankincense. Alexander the Great lay dead at 32, his body transitioning from a vessel of divine will into a political problem. Outside the heavy cedar doors, the city of Babylon did not erupt into immediate chaos, nor did the far-flung provinces of the empire instantly dissolve into tribalism. Instead, the silence of the palace was mirrored by the rhythmic scratching of reed pens in the administrative quarters below. The king was gone, but the machinery he had inherited, modified, and expanded, a sophisticated ghost in the machine, continued to function. This transition was marked by a profound psychological vertigo. The men who had followed Alexander across the Jaxartes now found themselves masters of a world that felt too large to hold. The spirit of the times was not one of liberation, but of a desperate, clutching grip on the status quo. Driven by this collective anxiety, the generals did not seek to dismantle the empire, but to secure their place within its gears. Inevitably, the partition of Babylon became the first act of a new era, where the durability of the administrative foundation proved more resilient than the man who had supposedly built it. The survival of this vast realm was not an accident of military might, but a consequence of Alexander's calculated decision to preserve the Achaemenid Persian bureaucracy. He had not burned the tax ledgers of the great king. He had simply changed the name at the top of the scroll. Consequently, when the Diadochi, the successors, gathered to divide the satrapies, they were inheriting a functioning revenue system that knew exactly how many bushels of grain were owed by a village in Cappadocia and how much silver was stored in the vaults of Ecbatana. A forensic look at the records of the Esagila temple from that summer reveals a startling continuity. The daily sacrifices and economic transactions proceeded as if the throne were merely vacant for a long weekend. This administrative inertia provided the stability necessary for the successors to begin their long wars without the total collapse of the agrarian economy. Had the Greek generals attempted to impose the localized, often chaotic governance of the Hellenic polis onto the Near East, the empire would have fractured into 1,000 warring city-states within a year. Instead, the Persian model of the satrapy provided a sturdy container for Greek ambition. In a dusty administrative office in Sardis, a minor scribe named Apollonius represents the human face of this continuity. He had served under a Persian satrap, then an officer of Alexander, and now he prepared his ledgers for Antigonus Monophthalmus. To Apollonius, the identity of the man on the horse was secondary to the precision of the tax harvest. He represents the millions of faceless bureaucrats whose daily adherence to routine prevented the Hellenistic world from sliding into the abyss. The machinery of empire was maintained by men who never saw a battlefield, yet whose mastery of the census and the toll road ensured that the armies of the Diadochi remained paid. Because the silver of the treasury had been standardized and the trade routes cleared of bandits, the economy could withstand the shock of the king's death. The conflict between the generals was chaotic and fast-paced, a bloody scramble for legitimacy that saw Perdiccas murdered by his own officers and the royal family systematically liquidated. Yet the slow, deliberate work of the bureaucracy acted as a ballast, keeping the ship of state upright even as the captains fought for the wheel. The long-term impact of Alexander's city founding was the second pillar of this enduring infrastructure. These 70-odd Alexandrias were not merely military garrisons, they were nodes in a new, globalized circuit. They functioned as cultural and economic transformers, turning local resources into Hellenized capital. The founding of Alexandria in Egypt, instance, was a masterpiece of forensic planning, positioned to bridge the wealth of the Nile with the trade of the Mediterranean. Because these cities were built on the template of the Greek agora, but supported by the deep agricultural wealth of the East, they created a synthesis that outlived any individual dynasty. The trade in pepper, silk, and incense began to flow through these new channels, creating a commercial reality that made the political borders secondary.
The Hellenistic world was born from this economic integration. It was a world where a merchant from Rhodes could find a familiar legal structure and a stable currency in a city on the edge of the Hindu Kush. This connectivity was the true legacy of the conquest, a web of urban centers that acted as a safety net for civilization during the decades of war that followed the king's demise. There exists a profound counterfactual tension in the events following the partition of Triparadisus in 321 BCE. Had the regency of the empire been held by a single visionary hand for just a decade longer, the centralized authority might have solidified into a monolithic, perhaps brittle autocracy. Instead, the friction between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Asia forced the machinery to become more flexible and adaptive. Each successor state was forced to refine its own version of the Greco-Persian synthesis to survive. The Ptolemies, particularly, leaned heavily into the ancient Egyptian ghost, adopting the role of pharaohs to command the loyalty of the priesthood, while using Greek financial techniques to maximize the output of the delta. This hybridity became the blueprint for the Mediterranean's future. The Seleucids, governing a sprawling territory of diverse ethnicities, relied on the Achaemenid royal roads and postal systems to keep their disparate provinces linked. The machinery was not just surviving, it was evolving into something more sophisticated than anything the world had yet seen. Ultimately, the synthesis of Achaemenid infrastructure and Greek administrative innovation provided the essential template for the Roman Empire. When Roman quaestars later arrived in the East, they did not find a vacuum. They found a pre-existing, highly efficient system of tax farming, provincial governance, and urban networks that they could simply adopt and scale. The census records and land surveys codified by the Diadochi were the same tools that would eventually allow Rome to manage its own vast territories. The ghost of Alexander's administration still haunts the bureaucratic halls of the modern state, where the impulse to categorize, tax, and connect survives in every digital database and trade agreement of the 21st century. The modern world's reliance on centralized financial systems and globalized trade nodes is a direct descendant of the ledgers kept in Babylon during that frantic summer. A border drawn in a palace tent by candlelight or a tax bracket established by a scribe in a sun-drenched office still subtly dictates the flow of wealth and power across the same ancient landscapes today. The machinery proved more resilient than the man, ensuring that while the king died in a fevered delirium, his vision of an integrated world would never truly draw its last breath.
You will hand over that document, Eumenes. It is mine by right of conquest. The will of Alexander must be honored, General.